Number 1. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. In the lush, damp, and often overcast landscape of the Pacific Northwest, specifically the region south of Seattle, a terrifying shadow was cast over the community beginning in the summer of 1982, a shadow that would eventually grow to eclipse almost every other serial murder case in American history. This is the story of Gary Leon Ridgway, a man who, by all outward appearances, seemed to be the very definition of average, blending into the background of industrial Washington state as a dedicated truck painter for Kenworth, but who harbored a darkness so profound and a compulsion to kill so relentless that he would eventually confess to taking the lives of more women than any other serial killer in United States history. The saga of the Green River Killer is not just a catalog of gruesome crimes, but a decades-long chronicle of investigative frustration, technological evolution, and a heartbreaking loss of vulnerable women who slipped through the cracks of society, only to be brutally extinguished by a man who viewed them as nothing more than garbage to be thrown away. To understand the magnitude of Ridgway's evil, one must first look at the unassuming and pathetic nature of the man himself. Born in Salt Lake City, Utah, in 1949, Ridgway moved to Washington at a young age and struggled significantly with his social development and his relationships with women, issues that were deeply rooted in his early life. He was raised by a harsh, domineering mother who frequently berated and belittled him, creating a deep-seated resentment and sexual confusion that would fester for decades. As a young man, Ridgway's inability to connect with women manifested in a series of failures. He was awkward, lacked confidence, and was unable to maintain normal relationships. This frustration led him to seek out sex workers, a demographic that would eventually become his primary target, not because of hatred for prostitution itself, but because these women were accessible, vulnerable, and, in his twisted worldview, less likely to be missed immediately or investigated thoroughly by law enforcement. His military service during the Vietnam War was another crucible for his violent fantasies, where he reportedly had sexual relations with prostitutes during his deployment and began to develop a violent hatred toward them, fueled by his fear of venereal disease and his own inadequacy. By the time he returned to civilian life and settled in Auburn, Washington, Ridgway was a man teeming with uncontrollable urges, working a mundane job and living a life that screamed of mediocrity. Yet beneath the surface, a monster was preparing to strike. The nightmare officially began to unfold in July 1982, when the first victim, Winnie Lee Caulfield, a 16-year-old runaway, was found floating in the Green River, a tributary that winds through King County. Her discovery was a harbinger of a bloodbath. Just days later, the bodies of two more women, Opal Mills and Cynthia Hines, were discovered in the same vicinity, setting off alarm bells for local law enforcement. What followed was a systematic and terrifying spree of abduction and murder that would see Ridgway hunt relentlessly throughout 1982 and 1983, picking up women along the Strip in Seattle's Pacific Highway South, a notorious area known for prostitution and vice. Ridgway's method of operation was chillingly consistent. He would cruise the area in his red or white pickup truck, often posing as a customer or a father figure offering money or a ride. Once the women were in his vehicle, he would often engage them in a conversation about religion or sex, two topics that obsess him, before driving them to remote, wooded areas where he felt safe to exercise his violent impulses. He would typically strangle his victims with his bare hands, or sometimes with a ligature like a rope or a piece of clothing, often engaging in necrophilia with the bodies after death. He would then dump the bodies in clusters, often returning to the same dump sites to leave more victims, treating the wilderness like his own personal graveyard. The sheer volume of missing persons reports flooding the King County Sheriff's Office was overwhelming. Women were disappearing at an alarming rate, sometimes 2 or 3 a week, and while the families of these women pleaded for help, the initial response was hampered by the lifestyle of the victims, who were often dismissed by society and the media as merely runaways or prostitutes, a bias that allowed Ridgway to continue his killing spree with relative impunity for years. The formation of the Green River Task Force, a massive multi-jurisdictional effort, was a testament to the scale of the crisis, but despite the hundreds of detectives working around the clock and the millions of dollars spent, Ridgway remained elusive, hiding in plain sight. As the investigation deepened, the list of potential victims grew, with bodies being recovered from the banks of the Green River, in the wooded overgrowth of Star Lake, and later, in the deep wilderness of the so-called Pea Patch and along Highway 410. The detectives, led by figures like Dave Reichert and Bob Keppel, who had previously worked on the Ted Bundy case, faced an investigative nightmare. They were dealing with a killer who was highly mobile, extremely careful, and possessed no prior criminal record that would trigger attention. They interviewed Ridgway early on, in 1983, after he became a suspect because witnesses had seen him with some of the victims and his truck matched descriptions. Ridgway agreed to a polygraph test, a notoriously unreliable tool that he passed with ease, likely because he had dissociated from his crimes or was simply a practiced liar. He allowed investigators to search his home and his truck, finding nothing incriminating because he had meticulously cleaned and removed any trace evidence. Without forensic technology capable of linking him definitively to the victims, and with his charmingly bland demeanor convincing the investigators of his innocence, Ridgway was released from the suspect list, a decision that would haunt the task force for decades. During this period, the killings slowed down, leading to speculation that Ridgway had either been incarcerated, moved, or perhaps died. However, what actually happened was a shift in his behavior and the intervention of his third wife, Judith, whom he married in 1988. Judith provided him with the domestic stability and sexual attention he craved, momentarily quelling his murderous impulses. Yet, this period of calm was deceptive, as his need to kill never truly vanished. The investigation went cold, turning into a marathon of endurance for the detectives who refused to give up, constantly revisiting the evidence and waiting for the science of forensics to catch up with the darkness they knew existed in their community. The turn of the millennium brought a technological breakthrough that would finally crack the case wide open. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, DNA profiling technology had advanced to a level of sophistication that allowed investigators to re-examine evidence collected decades earlier using new techniques. The Green River Task Force, which had never been formally disbanded, began retesting minute biological samples recovered from the earliest victims, specifically semen found on the bodies of 4 victims: Opal Mills, Marcia Chapman, Carol Christensen, and Cynthia Hines. In 2001, the results came back, and they were unequivocal. The DNA profile from the semen matched Gary Ridgway. It was a moment the task force had waited 20 years for. They immediately placed Ridgway under 24-hour surveillance, watching his every move to ensure he did not kill again or flee. They collected saliva from a discarded cup or tissue he used at work to confirm the match independently, and once it was verified, they moved in. On November 30th, 2001, detectives arrived at the Kenworth plant where Ridgway was still employed, painting trucks as he had done for decades. He was arrested without incident, a quiet end to a decades-long reign of terror. When questioned, Ridgway initially maintained his innocence, sticking to the script that had served him so well in 1983, but when confronted with the irrefutable DNA evidence, his facade crumbled. He realized that the game was finally over, and the detectives, leveraging years of psychological profiling and experience in interrogating serial killers, began the long process of getting him to talk. The confession phase of the Gary Ridgway case is one of the most disturbing and extensive in criminal history. Facing the very real possibility of the death penalty, Ridgway decided to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a plea deal that would spare his life. Over the course of many months, he led detectives to the bodies of victims who had never been found, providing closure to families who had lived in purgatory for nearly 20 years. His confessions were clinical, devoid of emotion, and horrifically detailed. He recounted how he would lure women to his home sometimes, having sex with them in the bedroom he shared with his wife before taking them to the garage to kill them, or driving them to secluded spots where he felt a sense of ownership over the land. He described his method of killing with chilling detachment, explaining how he learned to strangle women efficiently to leave less evidence, and how he sometimes engaged in necrophilia with the bodies, posing them in lifelike positions to satisfy his disturbed urges. He spoke of choking the women, often burying them with rocks on top of their bodies to prevent detection by animals or search teams. Perhaps most hauntingly, he talked about his storage issue, where to put the bodies. He would return to dump sites to check on the remains, sometimes moving them if he thought they might be found. In one instance, he moved a body from the Green River to a more remote location after he heard search planes overhead. He admitted to killing women as recently as 1998, disproving the theory that had stopped in the mid-'80s, and he eventually confessed to a staggering 71 murders, although he was only charged with 49 of them where sufficient evidence existed to charge. The physical act of confessing, of taking detectives into the deep woods to point out patches of disturbed earth where the skeletons of the victims lay, was a grotesque tour of a hidden cemetery that only he knew the full extent of. The legal conclusion of the case came in 2003, when Gary Ridgway pled guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder in a courtroom packed with victims' families and media from around the world. It was a surreal and emotionally charged proceeding. The judge read out the names of the victims one by one, detailing how they died, while Ridgway stood and admitted to each count, saying "I did that" or "I am responsible" in a flat, emotionless voice. The families of the victims were given the opportunity to speak, and their testimonies were a cacophony of grief, anger, and relief. They told Ridgway exactly what they thought of him, calling him a monster, a coward, and a predator who stole their daughters, sisters, and mothers. He stood facing them, showing no reaction, a blank slate that seemed to absorb their hatred without flinching. The judge sentenced him to 48 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never see freedom again. He was transferred to the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, where he remains to this day. The plea deal that spared his life was a controversial decision, with many arguing that a man who committed such heinous acts deserved to die. However, the prosecutors and the task force defended the decision, arguing that without the plea deal, Ridgway would have taken his secrets to the grave, leaving 40 families without the remains of their loved ones. It was a utilitarian choice that prioritized closure for the living over retribution for the dead. In the aftermath of the Green River Killer investigation, the impact on law enforcement and forensic science was profound. The case exposed the systemic biases that existed in policing, highlighting how the crimes against sex workers and runaways were often deprioritized, a mistake that cost lives and allowed Ridgway to kill for so long. It led to changes in how missing persons cases are handled, pushing for faster response times and more serious consideration of the disappearances of marginalized individuals. Furthermore, the case stands as a landmark achievement for DNA technology and database matching, showcasing the power of science to solve cold cases that were once thought to be unsolvable. The Green River Task Force's dedication, despite the decades of silence and lack of leads, is studied in police academies as a model of persistence, even as it serves as a warning about the limitations of investigation before the digital age. Today, Gary Ridgway sits in his cell, an old man in his 70s, isolated and mostly forgotten by the world that was once terrorized by his name. He has given interviews occasionally, expressing a shallow sort of remorse, but maintaining that he did what he had to do because he couldn't stop. The families of his victims continue to live with the scars he left behind, but they finally have the truth. The Green River is no longer a dumping ground for the unwanted. It is a memorial. The woods have been searched and the bodies recovered. The silence that Ridgway exploited to hide his evil has been broken by the voices of the victims and the relentless pursuit of justice, though the scar he carved into the history of Washington State will never truly heal. This is a legacy of the Green River Killer, a terrifying reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind the most ordinary of faces, and the enduring need to look out for the most vulnerable among us before they are swallowed by the shadows. Number 2. Ted Bundy, the handsome devil of the Pacific Northwest. Before the world knew the name Ted Bundy as a byword for charismatic evil, he was Theodore Robert Cowell, a child born under a cloud of illegitimacy in 1946 to a single mother in Burlington, Vermont, who would later move him to Tacoma, Washington, to live with his grandparents under the ruse that he was their son and his mother was his sister, a family secret designed to hide the shame of his birth in the conservative 1940s. This foundational deception was the bedrock of a psyche that would fracture in the most spectacularly violent way imaginable, turning the quiet, rain-soaked streets of Seattle into the hunting ground for one of the most prolific and cunning serial killers in history. Bundy's story in Washington is not just about the murders. It is about the duality of a man who presented himself as a charming, articulate, and upwardly mobile Republican law student, while simultaneously waging a hidden war against young women, a war that began in the shadows of the evergreen state. Growing up in Tacoma, Bundy was a shy, socially isolated boy who was teased for his stutter and his awkwardness, but he harbored an intense intelligence and a burning desire to rise above his humble roots. He became obsessed with social standing and material success, eventually transforming himself into a figure charisma, a man who could captivate a room and win the trust of strangers. By the early 1970s, he was studying psychology at the University of Washington, working in politics, and dating a wealthy young woman named Stephanie Brooks, a pseudonym used in accounts, who represented everything he wanted: sophistication, class, and beauty. When the relationship ended because she found him lacking direction and ambition, Bundy's psyche snapped, shattering his fragile self-control and igniting a pathological rage toward women who looked like Stephanie, young, attractive, with long, center-parted hair. While he eventually won her back years later, only to cruelly dump her in revenge, the damage was done, and a dark compulsion began to manifest itself through a criminal escalation that started with petty theft and voyeurism and ended in the ultimate violence. The official killing spree in Washington state began in the early hours of January 4th, 1974, when Bundy entered the basement apartment of Joni Lenz, an 18-year-old dancer in Seattle, bludgeoning her with a metal rod from her bed frame while she slept, leaving her with permanent brain damage but alive. However, most criminologists consider his first murder to be that of Linda and Healy, a 21-year-old University of Washington student and radio personality who disappeared from her basement apartment in the University District just weeks later on the night of January 31st. Healy, a beautiful, popular woman with long brown hair, was taken from her bed, her sheets carefully stripped and folded, a hallmark of Bundy's meticulous, controlling nature, leaving behind a single bloodstain on her pillow as the only sign of the violence that had occurred. The discovery of her disappearance marked the beginning of a reign of terror that would paralyze the Pacific Northwest for the next several months. Over the following months, young women began vanishing from the Seattle and Olympia areas at an alarming rate. In March, Donna Gail Manson, a 19-year-old student at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, left her dormitory to attend a jazz concert on campus and was never seen again. 2 months later, Susan Elaine Rancourt, also a student at Evergreen, disappeared after a late-night meeting on campus. Then, in June, Roberta Kathleen Parks, a 20-year-old student from Oregon State University who was visiting friends in the Seattle area, vanished after leaving a dormitory to go meet someone for coffee. These women shared a striking resemblance. They were young, slender, with long hair parted in the middle. The investigation into their disappearances was hampered by the jurisdictional confusion between Seattle police, the King County Sheriff's Office, and campus security, and by the fact that these were women who simply didn't come home, often leading police to treat them initially as runaways rather than kidnapping victims, a classification that Bundy exploited. The summer of 1974 saw Bundy's crimes accelerate with brazenness that was both terrifying and, in hindsight, indicative of his growing confidence and God complex. On July 1st, Brenda Ball, a 22-year-old who worked at the Flame Tavern in Burien, was last seen leaving the bar and getting into a tan Volkswagen Beetle, a detail that would later become central to the case. She was never seen again alive. Just 4 days later, George Ann Hawkins, an 18-year-old student at the University of Washington, vanished in the middle of the night between two fraternity houses on Greek Row. Hawkins' case was particularly chilling because she was walking alone, a distance of only 100 yards, and disappeared in a matter of seconds. Later investigations and Bundy's eventual confession revealed that he had lured her by using a ruse, asking her for help carrying something to his car, a classic abduction technique that preyed on the natural helpfulness of his victims. The remains of Hawkins, along with several other victims, would eventually be found at a remote dumping ground in Issaquah known as Taylor Mountain, but at the time, their absence created a growing sense of panic among the student population and law enforcement. The peak of the Washington murders occurred on July 14, 1974, at Lake Sammamish State Park in Issaquah, a hot, busy summer day where the public nature of the abductions finally provided the clarity police had been lacking. In broad daylight, amidst hundreds of witnesses, Ted Bundy approached two different women using a crutch or a cast as a prop to elicit sympathy. He introduced himself as Ted. He asked Janice Ott, a 23-year-old probation worker, to help him carry a sailboat to his car, a brown VW Beetle. Witnesses saw them walk away together, chatting casually. Just 4 hours later, at the same beach, he approached Denise Naslund, a 19-year-old computer programmer and summer camp counselor. He asked her for help with the boat. She walked away with him and was never seen again. The Lake Sammamish abductions were the turning point in the investigation. For the first time, detectives had a reliable composite sketch of a suspect, a handsome, white male with brown hair parted in the middle, driving a tan or light brown Volkswagen Beetle. The police, led by the King County Major Crimes Task Force, were flooded with tips. Thousands of people called in, saying they knew someone who looked like the sketch, drove a VW Beetle, and was named Ted. It was a deluge of data that overwhelmed the detectives, who had to manually sort through the leads. One of those tips came from Bundy's former girlfriend in Seattle, who had seen the composite in the news and contacted police, suggesting that the man in the sketch looked like her ex-boyfriend, Ted Bundy. However, she also noted that he was a gentle, timid man who couldn't hurt a fly, and the police, having no physical evidence linking him to the crimes, placed him on the bottom of a list of hundreds of suspects. Another critical missed opportunity occurred in August 1974, when Seattle police stopped a light tan VW Beetle near the University District for driving erratically at night. Inside was Ted Bundy. He acted nervous but cooperative. The officer noticed that the passenger seat had been removed. In the back of the car, he found a crowbar, an ice pick, and a pair of handcuffs. Bundy claimed he had found them in a dumpster or needed them for work. Suspicious, the officer ran his license, found it clean, and let him go with a warning. The officer did not connect the seemingly respectable man to the serial killer case because the car was tan, not brown, and the suspect was not currently using a cast. It was a catastrophic failure of intuition and data matching that allowed Bundy to continue killing. By the fall of 1974, realizing that the heat was rising in Washington state and that police were closing on the profile of a VW driving Ted, Bundy abruptly vanished from the Pacific Northwest. He moved to Utah to attend law school, effectively ending the Pacific Washington chapter of his murders, though he continued to spree in Utah, Colorado, and later Florida. The silence in Seattle was not relief. It was a lingering dread. The investigation in Washington, however, did not stop. The discovery of remains at Taylor Mountain in March 1975, specifically the skulls of Roberta Parks and Brenda Ball, confirmed that these were not missing persons cases but homicides. The forensic examination showed that their skulls had been fractured, and some had signs of blunt force trauma. Meanwhile, Bundy was arrested in Utah for a failed kidnapping attempt, and as authorities in Utah and Colorado built cases against him, detectives in Washington, particularly King County detectives Dave Reichert and Bob Keppel, began to circle back to the name Bundy. They kept him on their radar, waiting for the evidence that would link the Washington victims to the man sitting in a Colorado jail cell. That link finally came in the form of forensic odontology. While preparing for the Chi Omega murder trial in Florida in 1978, investigators discovered that the bite marks on the buttocks of one of the Florida victims perfectly matched Ted Bundy's teeth. This breakthrough gave Florida prosecutors a slam-dunk case. But Washington needed its own closure. During the extradition hearings and legal maneuvering, Bundy was indicted for the aggravated first-degree murder of Karen Campbell in Colorado, and the Washington detectives interviewed him repeatedly. Bundy, acting as his own attorney, was arrogant and dismissive, believing he was too smart to be convicted of the Washington murders where there was no direct eyewitness, and he had left the state before bodies were found. It wasn't until Bundy was convicted and sentenced to death for the Florida murders, facing the electric chair, that he finally agreed to talk about the Washington cases. It was a bargaining chip he used to buy time and to satisfy his own ego. He wanted to confess to the killings in Washington without the risk of a trial, because he knew that once the specific details of the Taylor Mountain crimes came out, they would be too gruesome even for his manipulative persona. In the days leading up to his execution in January 1989, Ted Bundy sat with Bob Keppel and granted a series of chilling interviews that detailed the Washington murders with a cold, clinical precision that was as horrifying as it was illuminating. He confessed to the murders of Linda Healy, Donna Manson, Roberta Parks, Brenda Ball, George Ann Hawkins, Janice Ott, Denise Naslund, and several others whose names were lost to history or whose bodies had never been found. He described the abduction of George Ann Hawkins in vivid detail, explaining how he struck her from behind and dragged her into a pre-dug hiding spot unconscious to avoid detection before moving her body. He revealed that he would return to the dump sites at Taylor Mountain to have sex with the decomposing bodies, sometimes applying makeup to the skulls of his victims, a practice known as necrophilia that underscored the depth of his psychological need for total possession and control over the women he could never relate to in life. He described the Lakes of Mammoth abductions as a double kill that fed his narcissism, describing how he walked away with Janice, while Denise Naslin's friends were just yards away, invisible to him because he was so singularly focused on his object. He admitted to killing Linda Healy and hiding her body, which was never found, in the rugged mountains east of Snoqualmie Pass. These confessions provided the families of the victims with the answers they had waited a decade for, though they offered little comfort. Bundy's descriptions were not filled with remorse, but with a detached, analytical curiosity, as if he were describing the behavior of another animal entirely. He explained his entity theory, claiming that a force inside him compelled him to commit these acts, a force that grew stronger with every kill, eventually consuming him until he could no longer control it. It was a psychological profile of a classic psychopath, a man devoid of empathy, who viewed human beings as objects to be collected and discarded. The legal outcome for Washington's victims was largely posthumous. While Bundy was executed in Florida for the Chi Omega sorority murders and the murder of Kimberly Leach, the Washington cases were effectively closed through his confessions rather than a courtroom trial. The King County Prosecutor's Office filed warrants and prepared cases against him, but because Bundy was already on death row in Florida, extradition to Washington for trial was deemed unnecessary and expensive, with little purpose other than symbolism. Instead, the state of Washington achieved a form of closure through the discovery of remains and the acknowledgement of Bundy's guilt. The impact of Ted Bundy's crimes on the Washington community and the nation at large was profound. He shattered the image of what a serial killer looked like. Before Bundy, serial killers were often assumed to be shabby, disheveled loners who stuck to the shadows. Bundy was clean-cut, educated, and charming. He was a volunteer at a suicide crisis center, a political campaigner, and a law student. This allowed him to lure women into his car without a struggle, a fact that terrified the public and forced a massive reevaluation of safety education and police profiling. The case taught law enforcement the importance of interagency communication, as a failure to link the disappearances in Oregon, Washington, Utah, and Colorado delayed his capture. It also highlighted the importance of listening to women. The tips that came in from women who knew Bundy or had bad encounters with him were crucial, but initially overlooked. In the end, Ted Bundy met his end in the electric chair at Florida State Prison on January 24, 1989, but his ghost haunts the Pacific Northwest to this day. The sites of his abductions: the University District, Lakes of Mammoth State Park, the Flame Tavern, are locations that residents know by name, places that exist in the collective memory with a darker hue. The families of the Washington victims, like the parents of Linda Healy and Denise Naslin, have spent decades advocating for victims' rights and keeping the focus on the lives of the young women, rather than the fame of their killer. The case of Ted Bundy serves as a grim reminder that evil can reside in the most charming of smiles, and that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who look just like us. The Washington investigation, led by the tireless men of the Green River Task Force and the Major Crimes Unit who cut their teeth on Bundy, laid the groundwork for future serial killer investigations in the region. It established the protocols for tracking missing persons, the use of behavioral profiling, and the necessity of DNA evidence. Bundy's Washington murders were the genesis of a modern understanding of serial homicide, a terrifying chapter in the state's history where a handsome devil walked among the students, invisible until it was too late, leaving a scar on the landscape of the Pacific Northwest that will never fully fade. Number 3. Robert Lee Yates, a decorated soldier who brought his military discipline to the streets of Spokane. In the second half of the 1990s, the city of Spokane, Washington, known for its picturesque river falls and sprawling parks, became the hunting ground for a predator who operated with a terrifying level of precision, tactical efficiency, and anonymity. This is the story of Robert Lee Yates, Jr., a man who lived a double life of stark contrasts. On one hand, a devoted husband, a father of 5, and a decorated United States Army helicopter pilot who had served his country with distinction in combat zones overseas. On the other, a cold-blooded serial killer who methodically targeted the city's most vulnerable women, executing them with a soldier's calm and disposing of their bodies like hazardous waste. While the Pacific Northwest had already been scarred by the likes of Ted Bundy and the Green River Killer, The crimes of Robert Yates were unique in their cleanliness and lack of the sadistic sexual excess often associated with serial murder. Yates was a sanitized killer, a man who murdered not to indulge in violent fantasy, but to extinguish what he viewed as human liabilities, likely motivated by a mixture of self-loathing, religious delusion, and a compulsive need to control his surroundings. His case is a chilling study in how a person can exist in the heart of a community, respected and seemingly normal, while harvesting the lives of its marginalized citizens in the dark of night. To understand Robert Yates is to look into the abyss of a fractured psyche that compartmentalized extreme violence so effectively that even his own family had no idea a monster was living in their suburban home. Born in Spokane in 1952, Robert Yates grew up in a relatively stable environment and enlisted in the United States Army in 1971. Seeking structure and purpose, he found it in the Army, where he excelled as a helicopter pilot, eventually flying the H-1 Cobra attack helicopter. He served in Germany and participated in real-world combat operations, including a deployment to Somalia and the Gulf War, earning numerous medals, including the Army Commendation Medal and the Senior Army Aviator Badge. He was viewed by his peers as a highly competent, disciplined, and quiet professional, a man who could be trusted with multi-million-dollar machinery and the lives of his crew. He married his wife, Linda, in 1976, and they eventually settled in a quiet neighborhood in the Spokane Valley, a community defined by manicured lawns and middle-class values. However, beneath this veneer of stability, Yates was harboring a deep-seated compulsive behavior involving sex workers. As early as the mid-1970s, Yates began frequenting prostitutes, a habit that likely stemmed from a deep sense of shame and a desire for secret, transactional encounters that required no emotional connection. As the years passed, this compulsion escalated from patronage to predation. His first known murder occurred in 1975 in Walla Walla, Washington, where he killed Patricia McIntosh, a college student, shooting her and burying her body in a wheat field. At that time, he was a young soldier, and the crime went unsolved, blending into the cold case files of the era. This initial act of violence was a dormant volcano that would not erupt again in a major way for nearly 2 decades, but the magma was there, simmering beneath the surface, fed by a lifestyle that revolved around clandestine sexual encounters and a growing contempt for the women he paid for. The Spokane killing spree, which would ultimately define Yates as one of Washington's most prolific serial killers, began in earnest in 1996 and continued through 1998, a period during which Yates was working as a maintenance supervisor for a manufacturing company and living his seemingly idyllic family life. His hunting ground was a Skid Row area of East Sprague Avenue in Spokane, a desolate strip of motels, drug dens, and sex work that existed in stark contrast to the city's polished downtown image. Yates prowled this area in his vehicle, initially a beige 1977 Corvette and later a white 1980 Chevy pickup truck or van, looking for women who were out on the fringes of society, women who were addicted to drugs, experiencing homelessness, or simply working the streets to survive. These were women who, like the victims of the Green River Killer, were often ignored by the broader community and law enforcement, a vulnerability that Yates calculated and exploited. His method of operation was terrifyingly swift and lethal. Unlike Bundy, who sought to dominate and torture, or Ridgway, who engaged in necrophilia, Yates simply wanted the women gone. He would pick them up, drive them to a remote, pre-selected location, often the vast, open agricultural lands of the Spokane Valley or near the Spokane Indian Reservation, and shoot them in the head. He would then dump their bodies in shallow graves covered by brush or debris, sometimes returning later to clean up the scene or move the remains if he felt they were too exposed. He treated murder like a military mission. Plan, execute, exfiltrate, debrief. The body count began to mount with horrifying speed. In August 1997, the body of Shawn Johnson, a 36-year-old mother, was found in a field in Cheney, east of Spokane. She had been shot in the head. A few months later, in November 1997, the remains of Jennifer Joseph, a 20-year-old Native American woman, were found in a field near Waverly, Washington. Her disappearance had been particularly painful for her family, and the discovery of her body confirmed that a serial predator was active. In December 1997, Yates struck twice in one weekend, killing Lori Wason and Linda Mabin. Their bodies were found in remote areas, similarly executed with a single gunshot or a small caliber weapon. The sheer number of missing women in the Spokane area eventually forced the Spokane Police Department to acknowledge a pattern they had initially missed. In 1998, a serial killer task force was officially formed to investigate the deaths of nearly a dozen women who'd been murdered or reported missing over the previous 2 years. The investigation was massive and complex, complicated by the lifestyle of the victims, whose networks were transient and whose movements were difficult to track. The detectives, led by individuals like John Baltzell and Mark Burbridge, worked tirelessly to piece together the movements of the women, looking for a common thread in their final hours. They interviewed pimps, sex workers, and drug users, slowly building a profile of a suspect who was likely a regular customer of the women, who drove a reliable vehicle, who had a familiarity with remote areas, and who was likely older and more organized. The breakthrough in the case came through a combination of forensic science and sheer, dumb luck. In April 2000, Yates was stopped by a patrol officer near Sprague Avenue in a routine traffic stop. The officer, suspicious of Yates' nervous demeanor and the fact that he was parked in a high prostitution area, ran his name and found no immediate red flags. Yates was let go, but the encounter stuck with the officer, who noted the vehicle and the driver. Months later, detectives reviewing the tips regarding the killer's vehicle found a match to Yates' description. Meanwhile, Yates had made a critical mistake in the disposal of one of his victims. He had murdered a woman named Christine Smith, whose body was found in a remote location. Through witness testimony and the tracking of vehicle sightings, the task force was able to link Yates to the area where several bodies were found. The most crucial piece of evidence came from a surviving victim, a woman named Shawn McClenahan. In 1998, McClenahan was picked up by a man driving a beige Corvette, fitting Yates' description, and driven to a remote area. Yates shot her in the head, execution style, but miraculously, the bullet grazed her skull rather than penetrating it. She played dead until Yates drove away, then managed to walk miles to safety with a severe head wound. Her description of the shooter, a clean-cut, older man in a beige Corvette, was inconsistent with the typical profile of a street criminal but matched Robert Yates perfectly. Armed with the survivor testimony and the circumstantial links to the vehicle and dump sites, the task force obtained a search warrant for Yates' home and vehicles in October 2000. The search of Robert Yates' home was a terrifying revelation for his family and the investigators. Inside his well-kept suburban house, amidst the family photos and military memorabilia, police found a hidden stash of items linked to the victims. They found jewelry, clothing, and other personal effects that belonged to the murdered women, trophies of the collection, kept just feet away from where his wife and children slept. They found a plastic gun barrel extender and ammunition consistent with the weapon used in the murders. Perhaps most damning was forensic evidence linking his vehicle to the location where one of the victims was found. Faced with this mountain of evidence, and realizing that his double life was obliterated, Robert Yates was arrested and charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community and the military. How could a decorated veteran, a man who flew helicopters in combat, be responsible for such methodical slaughter on the home front? The contrast between his public service and private depravity was almost impossible for the public to reconcile. His wife, Linda, maintained her ignorance of his crimes for years, stating that she had no idea her husband was a murderer, a testament to Yates' extraordinary ability to compartmentalize his life and mask his true nature from those closest to him. In 2002, Robert Yates pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder in Spokane County to avoid the death penalty. The plea deal was controversial but practical, sparing the families of the victims from a lengthy and traumatizing trial while guaranteeing that Yates would die in prison. The judge sentenced him to 408 years in prison without the possibility of parole. However, the legal story was far from over. Prosecutors in Pierce County, where Yates had also dumped bodies, sought to try him for additional murders to secure a death sentence. Specifically, they targeted the murders of 2 women, Melody Murphin and Abigail Coates, whose bodies were found on the property of the Crest Motel in Pierce County, a location Yates had access to due to his work. In a separate trial in 2003, Yates was convicted of the murders of 2 women in Pierce County and was sentenced to death. This legal tug-of-war highlighted the different approaches of various jurisdictions in dealing with serial killers, with Spokane prioritizing closure and certainty of imprisonment, and Pierce County seeking ultimate retribution. Yates remained on death row for years, but his sentence was eventually commuted to life in prison in 2018 following a ruling by the Washington State Supreme Court that the state's death penalty statute was unconstitutional. He is currently serving multiple life sentences at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, the same facility where he was once housed awaiting execution. While the Spokane plea deal covered the bulk of his known victims, Yates eventually confessed to more murders as he sat in prison, unburdening himself of the secrets that had plagued him for decades. In 2002, he admitted to the 1975 murder of Patricia McIntosh in Walla Walla, providing investigators with the location of her body, which had been missing for nearly 3 decades. He also confessed to the 1988 murder of a woman named Connie Ellis in Spokane, revealing that his killing spree had actually spanned 25 years, not just a cluster of years in the 1990s that originally defined the investigation. These cold case confessions brought a measure of closure to families who had given up hope, proving that Yates' pathology was a lifelong condition that pulsed through his veins regardless of his rank or accolades. The case of Robert Yates serves as a grim lesson in the danger of invisibility. He killed women who were largely invisible to society, using the skills he learned as a soldier to hunt them in silence. He was a stealth killer, relying on order, discipline, and the assumption that no one was looking for the women he took. The legacy of his crimes is twofold. It exposed the need for law enforcement to prioritize the disappearances of marginalized women, and it shattered the illusion that military honor and family values are a guarantee against evil. Robert Yates sits in his cell today, an old man, stripped of his medals and his freedom, forced to live with the reality that his legacy is not one of service, but of silence and bloodshed in the quiet fields of the Pacific. Number 4, Warren Leslie Forrest, the Phantom of Doe Valley. In the early 1970s, the rural woodlands of Clark County, Washington, specifically the dense, second-growth timber area known as Doe Valley, became the setting for a nightmare that seemed plucked from the pages of a horror novel, a place where the line between the safety of civilization and the savage of the wild was brutally erased by a man known as the Ted of the Woods. This is the story of Warren Leslie Forrest, a seemingly unremarkable security guard and maintenance worker whose bland exterior masked a predatory psychosis that turned the forest southwest of Vancouver into his personal killing field. While the Green River Killer would later dominate the headlines of the state with a high volume of victims in the 80s, and Ted Bundy with his charisma in the 70s, Warren Forrest operated in the shadows, a quiet, localized predator whose crimes terrorized the community and baffled investigators for years. Forrest represents a different archetype of serial killer, the disorganized yet opportunistic loner who used the landscape itself as a weapon, hunting in the same terrain he knew intimately, burying secrets beneath the ferns and fir trees that still guard those grim secrets today. His case is a testament to the patience required in cold case investigations and the incredible advances in forensic science that can finally drag a killer out of the shadows decades after the blood has dried. To understand the terror that gripped Vancouver and the surrounding areas, one must peel back the layers of a man who appeared to be a dutiful employee and a harmless neighbor, but who was, in reality, accumulating a body count in the woods behind his home. Warren Forrest was born in 1949 in Portland, Oregon, but he grew up in the Vancouver area, a region that at the time was transitioning from a quiet, semi-rural community to a sprawling suburb. Described by those who knew him as high-strung, nervous, and socially awkward, Forrest drifted through life without ever really finding his footing. He held a series of menial jobs, working as a security guard and a janitor, positions that gave him a sense of authority, but also kept him on the fringes of society. He lived a solitary existence, a man who seemed uncomfortable in his own skin, perpetually on edge. Beneath this anxious veneer, however, lurked a violent fascination with death and a deep-seated resentment toward women. Long before his first known murder, Forrest had exhibited troubling behavior. He was known to make inappropriate comments to women and had a history of minor run-ins with the law, but nothing that raised an alarm for serial murder. He was, by all accounts, invisible, a feature of the background scenery of Clark County. This invisibility became his greatest asset. It allowed him to prowl the streets and the woods without attracting attention, a ghost in plain sight, watching, waiting, and planning. His chosen hunting ground, Doe Valley, was a rugged, isolated network of logging roads and dense undergrowth, a place where teenagers would go to party or where drifters might camp. It was a place where screams went unheard and evidence was quickly swallowed by the damp earth, the perfect theater for Forrest's dark fantasies. The first confirmed victim to fall into Forrest's trap was Jana Jarvis, a beautiful and vibrant 18-year-old girl who vanished on June 11, 1973. Jana was last seen hitchhiking in Vancouver, a common mode of transportation in the 70s. She was on her way to visit a friend or perhaps just running an errand. The specifics of her destination are lost to time, but the moment she stepped into Warren Forrest's vehicle, her fate was sealed. Forrest likely offered her a ride, his harmless appearance disarming her. He drove her out to Doe Valley, a place he knew intimately. It is believed he took her deep into the woods, possibly under the guise of a shortcut or a stop to look at something. Once they were isolated, the transformation occurred. The nervous security guard became a killer. Jana was shot, likely by a .22 caliber firearm, a weapon favored for its quiet report and efficiency. Her body was not found immediately, and for months, her disappearance was a mystery that tormented her family. Her brother, Tom Jarvis, mounted a massive private search effort, printing flyers and combing the woods, driven by a desperate need to find his sister, unaware that the man responsible was likely watching the search efforts from the periphery. The silence of the investigation in the months following Jana's disappearance only emboldened Forrest. He had gotten away with it. The earth had kept a secret, and the police had no leads. This silence was a green light for him to kill again. Less than a year later, in March 1974, the monster struck again. Christina Blake, a 20-year-old woman who also lived in the Vancouver area, disappeared under similarly mysterious circumstances. Like Jana, Christina was last seen in the company of a man driving a vehicle, though the initial descriptions were vague. She was vulnerable, perhaps marginalized by society, or simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Forrest picked her up, presumably using the same ruse of offering a ride, and transported her to the remote sanctity of Doe Valley. There, he executed her with the same cold detachment he had used on Jana Jarvis. He shot her and left her body in the woods, not far from where Jana lay. But unlike Jana, Christina's disappearance was part of a growing pattern that police were struggling to identify. The woods of Clark County were yielding their dead, but slowly, and a connection between the two cases would not be definitively made until the bodies were found. The isolation of the dump sites meant that it could take months or even years for the remains to be discovered by loggers, hikers, or hunters. The frustration for law enforcement was palpable. They knew women were disappearing, but they had no bodies, no witnesses, and no murder weapon. They were chasing a ghost. However, Warren Forrest's luck eventually ran out, not through forensic brilliance, but through the sheer determination of survivor. In May 1974, Forrest attacked a young woman who managed to survive his assault. The details of the encounter are harrowing. Forrest picked up the woman, drove her to a remote area, and attempted to kill her. Whether it was a misfire, a struggle, or a sudden moment of instinct, the woman fought back or fled into the woods, escaping with her life. She flagged down help and was able to provide a description of her attacker and his vehicle. While forensic science in the 1970s was primitive compared to today, the survivor's testimony was the break that detectives needed. They focused their investigation on Warren Forrest, a local man who matched the description and drove a similar vehicle. When they interviewed him, his high-strung, nervous demeanor raised red flags, and circumstantial evidence began to mount. They linked him to the survivor's case, and as they dug deeper, they realized he was a prime suspect in the disappearances of Jarvis and Blake. Forrest was arrested and charged with assault in connection with the surviving victim's case. But without bodies, proving murder was impossible. He was a suspect, yes, but he wasn't a convicted killer yet. In a twist of fate that seems almost cinematic, while in custody or shortly after, Forrest managed to escape from custody or a transport situation in 1977, leading to a brief but intense manhunt. He was recaptured, cementing his status as a dangerous fugitive, but the ultimate evidence, the bodies of Jana Jarvis and Christina Blake, was still missing. The turning point in the case came with the discovery of the remains. In 1974, hunters or loggers stumbled upon the skeletal remains of Christina Blake in Doe Valley. The location was remote, buried under brush. It was a grim discovery, but it provided the police with a crime scene. Shortly thereafter, the remains of Janet Jarvis were found in the same general vicinity, linking the two women definitively to the same killer and confirming the worst fears of the Jarvis family. The bodies were found in such a state that determining the exact cause of death was difficult, but the location, the trajectory of the disappearances, and the evidence against Forrest from the survivors' attack were enough to build a case. The state of the remains, bleached by the sun and scattered by animals, testified to the long period they had lain undiscovered in the Ted of the Woods territory. Forrest was eventually charged and brought to trial for the murders of Janet Jarvis and Christina Blake. The prosecution relied heavily on the survivors' testimony to establish his modus operandi, luring women to the woods and attempting to kill them, as well as the circumstantial links Forrest had to the victims and the area. In 1978, Warren Forrest was convicted of first-degree murder. The court found him guilty of taking the lives of Jana and Christina. He was sentenced to life in prison, but due to the laws of the time, the definition of life was murky, and there was a possibility of parole. The community breathed a sigh of relief. The Phantom of Dole Valley was behind bars. But the story did not end there. For decades, Warren Forrest sat in prison, his name fading from the headlines, yet he remained a suspect in other unsolved murders in the region. Two other cases, in particular, haunted the cold case files: the murders of Martha Morrison and Carol Valenzuela. Both women were found murdered in September 1974 in a wooded area near the Washington-Oregon border, near the town of Dole Valley/Chinook. Their bodies have been placed in shallow graves, posing a disturbing question to investigators. Was Forrest responsible for these deaths as well? The initial investigation in the 70s couldn't link him definitively to Morrison and Valenzuela due to a lack of technology. The victims had similarities to Jarvis and Blake. Young women, vulnerable, picked up and transported, but without DNA, the physical evidence was circumstantial. The cases went cold, and Forrest maintained his innocence regarding those specific murders, content to serve his time for the two he had been convicted of. However, the wheels of justice turn slowly, but they do turn. As technology advanced, forensic scientists in Washington state began re-examining evidence from unsolved homicides, using modern DNA techniques to see if new leads could be extracted from old, degraded samples. In the 2000s and 2010s, the Clark County Cold Case Squad, along with the Washington State Attorney General's office, revisited the Morrison and Valenzuela murders. They had recovered hair and fiber evidence from the crime scenes years ago, evidence that was useless at the time, but held the key to the truth. Through mitochondrial DNA testing and other advanced methods, they were able to link biological evidence found at the scene to Warren Forrest. The science confirmed what the detectives had long suspected, that Warren Forrest was not just a two-time killer, but a serial predator responsible for at least 4 murders and likely more. Based on this new DNA evidence, Forrest was charged with the murders of Martha Morrison and Carol Valenzuela in 2018. He was already an old man, approaching his 70s, living out his days in a prison cell. The charges were a formality in one sense. He was already serving life, but necessary one for the families of the victims who had waited over 40 years for answers. The trial or plea agreement process for these additional murders brought closure to Morrison and Valenzuela families, who had lived with the uncertainty of not knowing who took their loved ones. It solidified Forrest's legacy as one of the most dangerous killers in Washington history. Today, Warren Leslie Forrest remains incarcerated, serving his life sentences at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. The moniker Ted of the Woods has faded from popular memory, replaced by newer, more sensational cases. But for the families of Janet Jarvis, Christina Blake, Martha Morrison, and Carol Valenzuela, the pain is eternal. The case of Warren Forrest serves as a chilling reminder of the vulnerability of hitchhikers and the dangers posed by the quiet, unnoticed men who live on the margins of society. It also highlights the incredible tenacity of law enforcement and victim advocacy groups who refuse to let these cases die. The woods of Dole Valley are quiet now. The logging roads grown over are managed, but the trees still stand over places where these young women lost their lives. Warren Forrest tried to hide his evil in the vastness of the Pacific Northwest wilderness, but through the persistence of investigators and the march of science, he was dragged into the light. He will die in prison, a forgotten phantom of a darker era in the state's history, a man who thought the woods would keep his secrets forever, only to find out that the truth, like the trees, has deep roots that cannot be easily uprooted. Number 5. Kenneth Bianchi, the deceptive charmer who brought the legacy of the Hillside Stranglers to the quiet streets of Bellingham, in the pantheon of American serial killers. Few partnerships were as volatile, destructive, and bizarre as the collaboration between Kenneth Bianchi and his cousin Angelo Buono, a duo known to the world as the Hillside Stranglers, but for the state of Washington. Kenneth Bianchi's legacy is written in the blood of 2 young women murdered in the rainy college town of Bellingham in 1979, crimes that exposed the desperate need for law enforcement to communicate across state lines and revealed the terrifying adaptability of a psychopath fleeing his own shadow. The story of Kenneth Bianchi is one of profound deception. He was a man who desperately wanted to be a figure of authority, a police officer, a savior, yet who harbored a compulsion to kill that he could not control, hiding his brutality behind a facade of boyish charm, intelligence, and manufactured multiple personalities designed to evade justice. Born in Rochester, New York, in 1951, Bianchi's life began with abandonment. His biological mother, an alcoholic prostitute, gave him up for adoption at birth, a trauma that likely formed the roots of his deeply fractured identity. He was adopted by a middle-class couple, the Bianchis, who raised him in relative comfort, but Ken grew up as a pathological liar, a chronic complainer, and a manipulator who constantly sought to elevate his status by fabricating stories. He drifted through his early adulthood with a distinct lack of direction, until he settled in Rochester and eventually moved to Washington State to live with relatives in the late 1960s. He found his way to the Cheney area, near Spokane, where he enrolled in college but failed to finish, and then moved to Bellingham. It was in Bellingham that Bianchi's ambition turned toward law enforcement. He applied to the police academy and even managed to get a job as a security guard, reveling in the pseudo-authority the uniform gave him. He would patrol the malls and streets of Bellingham, acting the part of cop, but the reality was that Ken Bianchi was a ticking time bomb of sexual repression and violent fantasy. He failed to enter the police academy, a rejection that stung his ego, and by the mid-1970s, feeling like a big fish in a small pond, he packed up his belongings and drove south to Los Angeles, California, seeking excitement and opportunity. It was this move to Los Angeles that would catalyze his transformation from a frustrated security guard into a prolific serial killer, introducing him to the man who would shape his darkest impulses, his cousin Angelo Buono. Angelo Buono was a man of singular cruelty, a narcissistic auto mechanic and pimp who viewed women as less than human, mere objects to be used and discarded. When Bianchi arrived in Los Angeles in 1976, he looked up to Buono, seeing in his cousin the alpha male dominance he lacked. They formed a twisted partnership that began with the procurement of women for Buono's prostitution ring, but quickly escalated into violent sexual assault and murder. Between October 1977 and February 1978, the 2 men terrorized Los Angeles, kidnapping, raping, and murdering 10 young women, dumping their bodies on the hillsides of the city, thus earning the moniker the Hillside Stranglers. The murders were acts of extreme sadism, often involving prolonged torture and the orchestration of the victims' deaths to satisfy their mutual desire for control. However, as the police dragnet in Los Angeles tightened and the partnership soured due to their mutual instability, Bianchi grew erratic. He was the weaker link in the chain, the follower who was overwhelmed by Buono's violence and the heat of the investigation. In early 1979, fearing they were about to be caught, and feeling the psychological weight of their crimes, Bianchi fled Los Angeles, leaving the killing ground to California behind and returning to the Pacific Northwest, settling back in Bellingham, Washington. He arrived with a resume of murder behind him, carrying a darkness that no one in Bellingham suspected. To the residents of this quiet college town, Ken Bianchi was just a friendly, if somewhat intense, neighbor. He worked as security guard at a local insurance company, lived in a modest apartment, and even dated a woman named Kelly Boyd, with whom he had a son. He tried to rebuild his life, attempting once again to join the Bellingham Police Department, and even going so far as to fake references and stalk the police chief in an effort to get hired. He was a man desperate to be a cop, desperate to wear a badge, even as he carried the secret of being one of the nation's most wanted killers. For several months, Bellingham was peaceful for him, a place to hide, but the urge to kill did not vanish with the change in zip code. It lay dormant, waiting for a trigger. The trigger came in January 1979, when the violence that defined the Hillside Stranglings resurfaced in Washington. On January 7, Bianchi spotted two female students from Western Washington University, Karen Mandick and Diane Wilder. Karen was a bright, spirited student who worked as a counselor at a group home for troubled youth, and Diane was her friend. Bianchi, utilizing his skills in deception, approached them with a ruse that played on their compassionate nature. He told them he was the assistant manager of the group home where Karen worked and offered them a job to help him guard the facility against vandalism, promising them a substantial sum of money. It was a classic predatory move, offering a legitimate opportunity to lower their defenses. The two women agreed and got into his car, a beige Volkswagen Beetle. He drove them to a remote, wooded area on the grounds of the Western Washington University campus, a place where the dense timber met the quiet isolation he needed to exercise his violence. Once they were in the woods, the security guard, disguise dropped, and the killer emerged. Bianchi attacked the two women. Karen Mandick was strangled manually, and Diane Wilder met a similar fate, her life extinguished by the very man they had trusted. Bianchi then left their bodies in the woods, hidden by the undergrowth, and returned to his daily life as if nothing had happened. For a short time, he believed he had committed the perfect crime. The bodies were concealed. The victims were not prostitutes like those in Los Angeles, but college students, which might confuse the profile, and he had no direct ties to the girls other than a fake job offer. The discovery of the bodies of Karen Mandick and Diane Wilder on January 12, 1979, sent shockwaves through Bellingham. The community was terrified. The peaceful college town was no longer safe. The Whatcom County Sheriff's Office and the Bellingham Police Department launched a massive investigation, searching the campus and interviewing friends and family. The investigation was meticulous, and it wasn't long before detectives focused on the job offer. It was the only tangible link between the victims and the killer. They learned that a man claiming to be an assistant manager had lured them. Following the thread, they eventually zeroed in on Kenneth Bianchi. When they interviewed him, he was cooperative, charming, and denied involvement, but inconsistencies in his story and the sheer convenience of his connection to the victims kept him on the radar. The breakthrough came not from his charm, but from physical evidence and a bit of dumb luck. Detectives found muddy footprints at the crime scene that matched Bianchi's shoes. Furthermore, they connected a pair of gloves found near the bodies to Bianchi. And perhaps most damningly, a neighbor reported seeing Bianchi driving his car into the woods around the time of the murders. On May 12, 1979, Kenneth Bianchi was arrested for the murders of Karen Mandick and Diane Wilder. He sat in a jail cell in Washington, charged with 2 capital crimes. It appeared that the monster had been caught, but Bianchi, a man who had studied criminal psychology and police procedure from the other side, had one final card to play. Once in custody, Bianchi's behavior grew increasingly erratic. Facing the death penalty in Washington for the brutal murders of the 2 college students, he began to enact a desperate legal strategy, the insanity defense. He began exhibiting signs of a dissociative identity disorder, formerly known as multiple personality disorder, claiming to have an alter ego named Steve, who was the violent killer responsible for the crimes, while Ken was the innocent, helpful victim of his own mind. He confessed to the murders of Mandick and Wilder, but he did so through his lawyers, claiming that Steve had taken over his body. It was a performance worthy of a Hollywood drama, and Bianchi was convincing. He fooled several psychiatrists initially, who diagnosed it with a rare and genuine split personality. Had the investigation stopped there, Bianchi might have spent his life in a mental hospital instead of prison. However, the investigators in Washington were savvy. They knew Bianchi was intelligent and manipulative. They sent for the best forensic psychiatrist in the country, Dr. Martin Orne, to examine him. Orne was skeptical of the sudden onset of Steve. During their interviews, Orne noticed that when Bianchi was in Steve mode, his handwriting changed, but not in a way that suggested an altered state. It looked like a deliberate attempt to change his writing. Orne also used a classic hypnosis technique, telling Bianchi that in a multiple personality, one personality is often colorblind. Bianchi, playing the part to the hilt, fell for the trap and began acting colorblind as Steve, a physical impossibility that proved he was faking the condition. The gig was up. The multiple personality defense was shattered, leaving Bianchi exposed as a calculated liar trying to manipulate the legal system. With the insanity defense collapsing, Bianchi's legal team had to switch gears. Facing almost certain execution in Washington for the Mandic and Wilder murders, Bianchi decided to trade his life for his secrets. He confessed to the Bellingham murders without the alter ego defense, ensuring a life sentence instead of death. But more importantly, he offered up the Holy Grail to investigators. He confessed to being one of the Hillside Stranglers in Los Angeles, implicating his cousin Angelo Buono. This revelation sent shockwaves through the criminal justice system. The police in Los Angeles had been hunting for the Hillside Strangler for years, believing they were looking for a single killer or a small group, but they had never linked the case to a man living quietly in Washington. Bianchi struck a plea bargain with prosecutors in California. In exchange for immunity from prosecution for 5 of the Hillside murders, he agreed to testify against Angelo Buono. It was a controversial deal, sparing a known serial killer the death penalty, but it was necessary to ensure that Buono, the mastermind and primary sadist, was taken off the streets. In 1981, Bianchi was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole for the Washington murders. He was later sentenced to additional consecutive terms in California for the other Hillside murders. The trial of Angelo Buono was a circus of immense proportions, one of the longest and most expensive in California history, but it was Bianchi's testimony, despite his unreliability as a witness, that helped seal Buono's fate. Bianchi described the murders in graphic detail, describing how they would lure women using fake badges and police lights, how they would kidnap them, and how Buono would torture and kill them. Bianchi sat in the witness stand, a man who had tried to convince the world he was possessed by a demon, now serving as a key witness against his former partner in crime. Buono was eventually convicted of 9 murders and sentenced to life without parole. While the legal battles raged on, the families of Carignan and Dodd and Wilder had to watch as the killer of their daughters became a celebrity of sorts, the subject of books and documentaries, trading his freedom for notoriety. The tragedy of Bianchi's path is that he came to Washington to escape his crimes, but he couldn't escape himself. He brought the violence of Los Angeles to the quiet streets of Bellingham, extinguishing 2 bright futures in the process. Today, Kenneth Bianchi remains incarcerated, serving his time in the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. Over the decades, he has become a fixture of the true crime world, frequently appearing in documentaries from prison, maintaining a level of narcissistic engagement with the public. He has been denied parole repeatedly, largely due to the severity of his crimes and the manipulative nature of his personality. He attempted to gain a degree in psychology while in prison, and has even tried to sell his life story, attempts that have been blocked by victims' rights advocates who refused to let him profit from his evil. Angelo Buono died in prison in 2002, rotting away in a cell, silent and unrepentant until the end. The legacy of Kenneth Bianchi in Washington history is a cautionary tale about the failure of vetting in law enforcement, how a man so obsessed with becoming a cop could slip through cracks, and the terrifying reality that serial killers are not bound by geography. They can move from the urban sprawl of Los Angeles to the quiet forests of Bellingham, and the darkness follows them. The story of the Hillside Strangler who came north serves as a grim reminder that evil often wears a mask of normalcy, and sometimes it is wearing a security guard uniform and driving a Volkswagen Beetle. The 2 women he killed in Washington, Carignan and Dodd and Wilder, are remembered not just as victims of the Hillside Stranglers, but as individuals whose lives were stolen by a man who should never have been free to walk among them. Their memory is preserved by the Whatcom County cold case files and the determination of the detectives who saw through the Steve persona and ensured that Kenneth Bianchi would never leave prison alive. Number 6, Harvey Louis Carignan, the man known as the One-Ad Killer, who turned the search for honest work into a death sentence. In the grim lexicon of American serial killers, few monikers are as chillingly descriptive as the Want-Ad Killer, a title earned by Harvey Louis Carignan, a predator who weaponized the vulnerability and trust of people looking for employment to lure them into isolated wilderness locations where he could enact his brutal religious delusions. Born in 1927 in North Dakota, Carrigan's life was a timeline of escalating violence and systemic failures that allowed him to slip through the cracks of the justice system repeatedly. His path to becoming one of Washington's most feared killers began in 1949, when he was convicted of the rape and murder of Laura Sullivan in Alaska. However, through a convoluted series of legal appeals and a Supreme Court ruling regarding the definition of insanity at the time, Carignan death sentence was commuted to life, and he was eventually paroled in 1960. He returned to society, a violent offender with a documented history of sexual homicide, yet he was deemed rehabilitated by a system that failed to recognize the permanence of his psychopathy. Carignan drifted to the Pacific Northwest in Canada, leaving a trail of unsolved murders in his wake, before eventually settling in Snohomish County, Washington, in the early 1970s. By this time, Carignan had perfected a method of hunting that was both simple and diabolical effective. He realized that newspapers were filled with ads from people desperate for work, and that the promise of a paycheck could make even the most cautious person lower their guard. He began placing and responding to help-wanted ads in local papers, posing as a legitimate employer looking for general laborers or caretakers for a remote property. He would interview applicants in public places, presenting himself as a pious, God-fearing man, a Pied Piper figure who offered hope and employment to the down on their luck or the young and naive. Once he gained their trust, he would drive them to desolate locations, often near Lake Stevens or the remote logging roads of Snohomish County, where the persona of the employer would vanish, replaced by a religious zealot who believed he was delivering God's punishment. The case that finally broke the back of the want-ad killer occurred on August 17, 1973, and involved a remarkably brave young woman named Kathy Schultz. Kathy was a teenager living in Snohomish County who saw a want ad in a local newspaper for a general laborer to work at a resort or camp. She needed money and called a number. Speaking to Carignan, who arranged to pick her up, he was driving a yellow station wagon and appeared clean-cut and respectable. He drove her to a remote, wooded area near Lake Stevens under the guise of showing her the work site. Once they were deep in the forest, Carignan stopped the car. The shift in his demeanor was instant and terrifying. He drew a hammer from his vehicle and attacked Schultz, beating her brutally with the intent to kill. He dragged her from the car, likely intending to sexually assault her and hide her body as he had done with others. However, Kathy Schultz played dead. As Carignan moved her body and attempted to hide her, she regained consciousness and realized her only chance was to flee. She managed to stand up and run for the road, bleeding and battered. Carignan pursued her, but he was an older man, and she was fueled by adrenaline and terror. She managed to flag down a passing car, saving her life. Her detailed description of the man, his yellow station wagon, and the specific location of the attack gave the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office their first solid lead in what would become a series of investigations. Had Kathy Schultz not survived, Harvey Carignan might have gone on to kill many more, vanishing into the mist of Pacific Northwest history as an unknown specter. Instead, she became the survivor who took down the Pied Piper. Following the attack on Kathy Schultz, investigators began to uncover a disturbing pattern. As news of the assault broke, other missing persons cases in the region began to coalesce around Carignan's profile. They found that he had been active in placing ads, and that he was connected to the disappearances of other young women who had answered similar solicitations. Specifically, the body of a woman identified as Barbara B. was discovered in a remote area near Lake Stevens, dead from blunt force trauma. Another victim, identified as Jane Doe in some records, but later connected to Carignan through his confessions and investigative profiling, was found in similar circumstances. These women had been lured with the promise of work, driven to the woods, beaten with a hammer or a blunt instrument, and abandoned in shallow graves or left exposed in the undergrowth. The violence was excessive and punitive, driven by Carignan's twisted belief that he was cleansing the world of sin. He had even tried to recruit an accomplice in some instances, a tactic that eventually led to his capture. A teenager who had been hired by Carignan to help him move furniture eventually went to police, claiming that Carignan had tried to get him to help kill a woman. The investigation, led by detectives who were piecing together the timeline of the want-ad killer, converged on Harvey Carignan. They arrested him in September 1973, charging him with the assault on Kathy Schultz and, eventually, with the murders of the other women found in the Snohomish County woods. The prosecution of Harvey Carignan was a landmark case for the willingness of the legal system to rely on the testimony of a survivor in a serial murder case. Kathy Schultz was a star witness, testifying to the harrowing details of her abduction and assault. Her identification of Carignan was unwavering, and the physical evidence found at the crime scene, including his footprints and the location of the attempted murder, corroborated her story. Furthermore, the prosecution was able to link Carignan to the other bodies through the unique modus operandi: the use of want ads, the lure of employment, the specific type of weapon used, a hammer or pipe, and the remote dump sites. Carignan, acting as his own attorney during some of the proceedings, attempted to mount a defense based on religious insanity, claiming that he was acting on direct orders from God to kill these women. He claimed to be a soldier of Christ who was executing divine judgment. The jury was not moved by his grandiose delusions. In 1974, Harvey Carignan was convicted of the murder of Barbara B. and the attempted murder of Kathy Schultz. The judge, seeing a man who had already killed once in Alaska and returned to kill again in Washington, handed down a sentence designed to ensure he never saw freedom again. He was sentenced to 60 years in prison for the Washington crimes, a sentence that, while not a life term without the possibility of parole, effectively amounted to one given his age and the accumulation of charges. While the Washington case secured a massive sentence, it was an investigation into his past that revealed the full scope of his evil. Detectives from Minnesota and other jurisdictions began looking at cold cases that matched Carrigan's signature from his years on the run before settling in Washington. He was eventually linked to murders in Minnesota, specifically the killing of a young woman named Eileen Hunley, and potentially others in Alaska and Canada. However, due to legal maneuvering and the fact that he was already facing 60 years in Washington, additional prosecutions were often forestalled. Carignan was transferred to the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla to serve his time. Behind bars, Carignan remained a model prisoner in terms of conduct, though his demeanor remained chilling. He never expressed genuine remorse for his victims, viewing himself instead as a misunderstood vessel of divinity or a victim of the legal system. He resided in the prison for decades, becoming one of the state's longest-serving inmates. As the years turned into decades, the want-ad killer became a relic of a darker era, a fading memory for the public, but a permanent scar for the families of Barbara B. and for Kathy Schultz, whose life was forever altered by her decision to answer an ad in the paper. Harvey Louis Carignan died in prison on May 24th, 2023, at the age of 95. He died of natural causes while still incarcerated, a rare end for a serial killer who managed to cheat the electric chair not once, but twice in his lifetime. His death marked the final closure for the victims of the want-ad killer, closing a chapter that began in Alaska in the late 40s and ended in Washington nearly 75 years later. The legacy of Harvey Carignan is twofold. First, it serves as a grim warning about the dangers inherent in the gig economy and job hunting, a caution that remains relevant today as scams and predatory lures persist on the internet rather than in newspapers. Second, it is a testament to the resilience of survivors. Had Kathy Schultz not fought for her life and testified against him, Harvey Carignan would likely have continued his murderous pilgrimage across the country. The Snohomish County woods, once silent witnesses to brutality, have long since reclaimed the crime scenes, but the memory of the Pied Piper who promised work and delivered death remains a dark footnote in the history of the Pacific Northwest. Carrigan's life was a study in the failure of rehabilitation for the true psychopath. He was given a second chance after the 1949 murder, a chance he used to refine his tactics and kill again. It stands as a stark example to law enforcement and the judicial system that certain predators are beyond redemption and that their release is a sentence of death for the innocent. In the end, the want-ad killer did not outrun his demons, but took the courage of a teenage girl to make sure he couldn't outrun justice. Number 7. George Walter Russell Jr., the charmer who betrayed trust in the heart of the East Side. In the summer of 1990, the idyllic suburbs of the Seattle metropolitan area, specifically the affluent city of Bellevue and the surrounding East Side communities, were gripped by a terror that was not born a shadowy figure in a dark alley, but from within the circle of trust and intimacy. This is the story of George Walter Russell Jr., a man who earned the chilling moniker the Charmer because of his uncanny ability to use his good looks, his smooth-talking persona, and his feigned sensitivity to infiltrate the lives of women, only to extinguish them with a brutality that belied his polished exterior. Unlike the predatory drifters who hunted street prostitutes or the calculated stalkers who abducted strangers, Russell was a different breed of monster, a killer who operated in the domestic sphere, turning dates and acquaintances into crime scenes. His crimes in 1990 shattered the illusion of safety that the suburbs provided, proving that the most dangerous men are often the ones who know how to say all the right things, who hold open the door, and who smile while hiding a black void of rage and misogyny behind their eyes. George Russell's journey to becoming a serial killer was paved by a lifetime of learning how to manipulate people. Born in 1958, Russell grew up in an environment where he learned early on that charm was a currency that could buy him forgiveness, favor, and access to whatever he wanted. He was intelligent and articulate, but deeply narcissistic and sociopathic. He drifted through life living off the generosity of others, particularly women, whom he saw as objects to be used for shelter, money, and sex. He had a history of domestic violence, a fact that often went unnoticed or was excused by his charismatic apologies until it was too late. By the time he arrived in the Bellevue area in the late 1980s, Russell had honed his act to perfection. He presented himself as a successful, albeit down on his luck, professional, a man who just needed a break. He frequented bars and social gatherings on the East Side, scanning for women who were vulnerable, recently divorced, lonely, or perhaps simply too trusting, and he would sweep them off their feet. He would move into their homes, eat their food, and sleep in their beds, all while the darkness inside him was gathering strength, waiting for the slightest provocation to unleash itself in a storm of lethal violence. The first known victim of George Russell's 1990 spree was Mary Ann Gooden, a vibrant woman whose disappearance in July of that year marked the beginning of the nightmare. Mary Ann lived in an apartment complex in Bellevue, a place that felt safe and mundane. She was last seen in the company of George Russell, whom she had been dating or was at least friendly with. When she failed to show up for work and for commitments with family, concern turned to dread. A welfare check at her apartment revealed a scene of horrific carnage. Russell had bludgeoned Mary Ann to death, using such force that the room itself looked like the aftermath of an explosion. The violence was not just about killing. It was about utter annihilation. But Russell didn't stop there. In a move that would become a signature of pathology, he remained in the apartment or returned to it, spending time in the dead woman's home, eating her food, and even taking phone calls from her concerned family and friends, lying to them and telling them she was unavailable. He slept in her bed next to her body or returned after disposing of it, an act of profound disrespect and psychological disintegration that showcases detachment from humanity. He was playing house with a corpse, maintaining the facade of a normal relationship even as reality rotted in the next room. This period of nadir behavior, living among the dead, is what distinguishes Russell from many other killers. He didn't flee the scene immediately. He lingered in the wreckage of his own violence. The escalation came quickly, just weeks later, in August 1990, when Russell claimed the lives of two more women, Carmen Ross and Andrea Levine. Carmen Ross was an aspiring real estate agent, a woman described as kind, smart, and full of potential. She was found in her Bellevue home, brutally murdered. She had been bludgeoned and stabbed, a level of overkill that suggested a deep, personal rage. Andrea Levine was found in a similar state of disarray in her home in the nearby area. She, too, was a woman who had known Russell, who had likely let him into her life, perhaps hoping for companionship, only to find a predator. The investigation into these murders was launched immediately by the Bellevue Police Department, and the detectives quickly realized they were hunting a man who was not a stranger to the victims. The crime scenes were chaotic, but they also contained evidence of the killer's presence. There were no signs of forced entry at Carmen Ross's home, indicating that she had opened the door for her killer. There were no signs of robbery. The televisions were still there, the jewelry untouched. The motive wasn't greed. It was personal, sexual, and violent. As detectives processed the scenes, they found fingerprints, bloody footprints, and traces of DNA that would eventually point them toward a suspect who was already on the radar for domestic disturbances. The profile of the killer emerging from the task force was that of a personality-disordered male, someone who knew the victims, someone who was charismatic enough to get inside, but who flew into uncontrollable violent rages. The name George Walter Russell Jr. began to circulate as a person of interest. He was known to associate with all three women. He had been the last person seen with Mary Ann Gooden. He had been dating or friends with benefits with Carmen Ross. He was linked to Andrea Levine. The police brought him in for questioning. True to his nickname, the Charmer, Russell attempted to manipulate the detectives. He was cooperative, calm, and polite. He explained away the relationships, claimed he had nothing to do with the murders, and tried to cast suspicion on others. He used his good looks and his articulate speech to distance himself from the brutality of the crimes, acting as if the mere suggestion that he could commit such acts was absurd. However, the forensic evidence was overwhelming. The bloody fingerprints found at the scenes matched his prints. The shoe prints matched his shoes. The DNA profile recovered from the victims' bodies, and the scenes matched his biological markers. Furthermore, witnesses came forward to describe Russell's erratic behavior after the murders, his strange comments, and his possession of items that belonged to the victims. The noose was tightening, and even Russell's legendary charm couldn't talk his way out of the mountain of physical evidence that placed him squarely at the center of the slaughter. The arrest of George Russell Jr. marked the end of the reign of terror on the East Side, but began a long and difficult legal journey. He was charged with 3 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. The trial, which took place in King County, was a spectacle of legal strategy and psychological evaluation. The prosecution, armed with the forensic evidence and the testimony of experts who analyzed the crime scenes, painted a picture of Russell as a calculating, rage-filled predator who derived pleasure from the domination and destruction of women. They highlighted his history of domestic violence to show a pattern of behavior that culminated in the 1990 murders. The defense, in contrast, attempted to paint Russell as a man who was mentally ill, perhaps suffering from schizophrenia or dissociative disorders at the time of the crimes. They tried to argue that he didn't know right from wrong, or that he was too intoxicated to form intent. They brought in psychiatrists to testify about his mental state, hoping to spare him from the death penalty or to secure a lesser conviction. It was a classic battle of forensic proof versus psychiatric defense. However, the prosecution dismantled the defense's arguments by pointing out the planning and the deliberateness of Russell's actions. He hid bodies, he cleaned scenes, he lied to friends and family. These were not the actions of a man in a blind psychotic fury, but a cold, calculating sociopath cleaning up after his work. The jury was unmoved by the charm and the insanity pleas. They looked at the photos of the bludgeoned women and listened to the forensic evidence, and they saw a man who was fully in control of his faculties when he chose to kill. In 1992, George Walter Russell Jr. was found guilty on all counts. The sentencing phase was a tense moment for the families of Mary Ann, Carmen, and Andrea. The prosecution sought the death penalty, arguing the aggravating factors, the multiple victims, the cruelty, the breach of trust, warranted the ultimate punishment. However, the jury, after deliberation, decided against the death penalty. It is believed that the psychiatric testimony, combined with the fact that Russell did not have a prior criminal record for murder, though he had a history of violence, saved him from the execution chamber. Instead, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was a sentence that, while sparing his life, ensured that he would never again walk free to use his charm on another woman. He was sent to the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, stripped of the privileges he once enjoyed and confined to a world of gray walls and regimented routine. The reaction from the victims' families was mixed. Some wanted him dead, while others were satisfied that he would die in prison, a slow death of anonymity and confinement. Far removed from the bright lights and social circles of the East Side he once terrorized. The legacy of George Russell Jr. is a cautionary tale about the danger of ignoring red flags in relationships and illusion of safety in the suburbs. His crimes reveal that violence does not always come in the form of a stranger jumping out from the bushes. Often, it comes from the man you are dating, the friend who seems too good to be true, the charmer who is hiding a dark side. The case prompted discussions in the community about domestic violence and the importance of background checks and listening to one's intuition. It also highlighted the vital importance of forensic science. In the pre-DNA era, Russell might have walked away from these crimes, relying on his word against the police's suspicions. But the biological evidence left at the scenes told the story that the victims could not. It spoke of a blood trail that led directly to his door, a trail that no amount of charm could erase. George Russell remains incarcerated today, an old man now, his looks faded, his charm useless against the concrete walls of his cell. He occasionally comes up for parole reviews, but they are invariably denied, the board citing the heinous nature of his crimes and the permanent risk he poses to society. In the quiet neighborhoods of Bellevue and Seattle, life moved on. The homes where Marion Gooden, Carmen Ross, and Andrew Levine died have been sold and resold, the walls repainted, the memories of the violence scrubbed away or covered over by new memories of new families. But for those who remember the summer of 1990, the shadow of the charmer remains. It is a reminder of the fragility of life and the capacity for evil that can exist behind a smiling face. George Russell Jr. thought he was smarter than the police, smarter than his victims, and smart enough to get away with murder. He thought his charm was his shield. But he was wrong. Justice, like a persistent detective, knocked on his door eventually, and when it did, the charm dissolved, leaving only the monster underneath. The story of George Walter Russell Jr. is not just a story of murder. It is a story of the violation of trust, the sanctity of the home violated by a guest who turned executioner. It is a dark chapter in the history of the Pacific Northwest, a reminder that even in the most beautiful and prosperous places, there are wolves in sheep's clothing waiting for the chance to strike. Number 8, Douglas Arthur Perry, the killer who stalked the shadows of Tacoma's jungle. In the gritty underbelly of Tacoma, Washington, amidst the industrial shadows of the port and chaotic sprawl of the homeless encampments known as the jungle, a predator named Douglas Arthur Perry operated with stealth and brutality that went unnoticed by the broader public for nearly 2 decades. Known by the moniker the Chocolate Man, a nickname that belied the sweetness it implied, and hinted instead at a deceptive, smooth-talking facade. Perry was a fixture of the Tacoma streets in the 1980s and early 1990s. He was not the handsome, charismatic psychopath of the suburbs, nor the calculating truck painter of the Green River Killer. Perry was a different kind of predator, one who preyed almost exclusively on the most vulnerable women in the city, sex workers, drug addicts, and those living on the margins, utilizing the desolate geography of Tacoma to hide his atrocities. His story is one of a system that ignored the disappearances of the disposable, and a cold case unit that finally used science to drag him into the light long after he thought he had escaped his past. Born in 1955, Douglas Perry drifted through life with a criminal record that mostly consisted of petty crimes and assaults, painting a picture of a man with propensity for violence that the system failed to effectively rehabilitate. He was a known entity to the Tacoma Police Department, a frequent flyer in the booking rooms and holding cells, but never sufficiently dangerous to be kept off the streets for long. This revolving door of justice allowed him to cultivate a dark habit of targeting women who, in his twisted view, wouldn't be missed. The terror began to unfold in earnest in 1988 with the disappearance of Karen Marie Brown, a 22-year-old woman who was living a transient life in Tacoma. Karen, like many of Perry's eventual victims, was struggling with the difficulties of street life and was known to frequent the area around Puyallup River and the expansive wilderness known as the jungle. In October that year, she vanished. Her family, knowing the risks of her lifestyle, feared the worst but were met with indifference from a police force overwhelmed by other issues. It wasn't until weeks or months later, or perhaps even years, that the reality of her fate was cemented. Her remains were eventually found in a remote, wooded area, a victim of homicidal violence. The cause of death was consistent with violent assault, likely strangulation or blunt force trauma. But without a suspect and with the degradation of the evidence and the elements, the case went cold. Karen Brown became another statistic, a Jane Doe, or a file number in a dusty cabinet. Her murder a whisper in the wind that swept through the Tacoma encampments. Perry, having likely committed the crime, melted back into the anonymity of the streets, his reputation as a tough guy serving as a shield against suspicion from those who might have heard him brag or seen him with her. For years later, in 1992, the darkness struck again, revealing a pattern that law enforcement had failed to recognize in the earlier chaos. Cynthia Nelson, a 30-year-old woman who also navigated the precariousness of Tacoma's fringes, disappeared. Cynthia was last seen alive in the vicinity of the South Tacoma area, an industrial zone rife with prostitution and drug activity. Like Karen Brown, she was a woman whose absence was noted by few, but felt deeply by those who loved her. She was reported missing, but again, the resources allocated to finding a missing, marginalized woman were scarce. It wasn't until her body was discovered in a field or wooded area, Similar in isolation to the dump site of Karen Brown, that the case was formally treated as a homicide. The investigation into Cynthia Nelson's death was stymied by the same factors that hindered the Brown investigation: the lack of witnesses, the mobile lifestyle of the victim, and the absence of forensic technology capable of linking a suspect from a distance. To the detectives working the cases in the late 80s and early 90s, these were likely seen as isolated incidents, tragic but disconnected, the work of the dangerous nature of the streets rather than the hand of a single serial offender. The whispers of the chocolate man and his violent temper circulated among the women of the street, a piece of folklore that never made it into a formal police report. Douglas Perry was a suspect in the back of some minds, perhaps, but there was no proof. He was a ghost in the machine, a man who knew how to navigate the underworld, without leaving a trail of breadcrumbs that the police of that era could follow. For over a decade, Douglas Perry lived in the purgatory of the unsolved. The Tacoma of the 90s evolved, the jungle was eventually cleared out and redeveloped, and the city attempted to shed its gritty image. Perry continued to live in the Pacific Northwest, eventually moving to Olympia, Washington. He aged, his violence simmering beneath the surface, perhaps dormant, perhaps merely undetected. He lived as a free man, walking among the public, while the mothers of Karen Brown and Cynthia Nelson waited for answers that never came. The cold case files sat in storage, gathering dust, victims of the limitations of 20th century police work. The breakthrough in the case arrived only with the advent of sophisticated DNA databases and a relentless drive of cold case detectives who refused to let the files stay closed forever. As part of a broader effort in Washington state to review and reevaluate old evidence using modern forensic technology, the Tacoma Police Department reopened the cases of Brown and Nelson. Biological evidence collected from the crime scenes, semen, hair, or skin cells that had been preserved but were previously untestable, was sent to the state crime lab. The results were definitive. The DNA profile extracted from the victims matched a sample already in the system from Douglas Perry, who had been arrested on other charges over the years and swabbed for DNA. It was a smoking gun that the original detectives never had. In 2006, over 18 years after he killed Karen Brown, Douglas Arthur Perry was arrested in Olympia for the murders of Karen Brown and Cynthia Nelson. The arrest brought a sense of belated justice to the families, but also highlighted the tragedy of the time lost. The man who had stolen their daughters and sisters was not a mysterious phantom, but a known criminal who had been living in their midst. Perry was charged with 2 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. The trial, which took place in 2007, was a grim reflection on the past. The prosecution presented the DNA evidence, which was irrefutable, but they also pieced together the narrative of Perry's life and his violent tendencies. Witnesses took the stand to describe the atmosphere of Tacoma in the 80s and 90s, the fear that permeated the street-walking community, and the rumors that had always pointed to Perry. The defense attempted to mitigate the charges, perhaps arguing that the deaths were accidental or that the evidence was circumstantial beyond the DNA. But the scientific testimony was overwhelming. The jury was presented with a picture of a man who had exploited the vulnerability of women, used their bodies, and discarded them with the callousness of someone throwing away trash. The chocolate man persona was stripped away, leaving only the cold reality of a murderer. In 2007, Douglas Perry was convicted of the murders of Karen Marie Brown and Cynthia Nelson. The judge, looking at the brutality of the crimes and the lack of remorse shown by the defendant, sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was transported to the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla to join the ranks of other notorious serial killers from the state, a fitting end for a man who had treated human life so cheaply. The conviction was a victory for the cold case unit, proving that the passage of time does not erase the need for justice. It also served as a warning to those who thought they could get away with murder because their victims were ignored by society. Eventually, science catches up. The legacy of Douglas Perry is a sobering one. He represents the invisible serial killer, the one who doesn't make headlines until years later because his victims are deemed unimportant. His story forced a re-examination of how law enforcement handles missing persons cases involving vulnerable populations. The women of the jungle and the streets of Tacoma were no longer seen as just statistics. They were human beings whose lives mattered and whose deaths deserved to be solved. Today, Douglas Perry remains incarcerated, a relic of a darker time in Tacoma's history. The areas where he dumped his bodies have been transformed by urban development, erasing the physical scars of the crimes. But the memories remain for the families. Karen Brown and Cynthia Nelson are remembered not just as victims of Douglas Perry, but as women who, despite their struggles, were loved and missed. The closure of their cases, while late, provided a finality that allowed their families to stop looking over their shoulders and start looking toward healing. The case of the Chocolate Man stands as a testament to the persistence of memory and the unyielding march of forensic science. It proves that justice may be delayed, but it is not always denied. Douglas Perry tried to bury his secrets in the damp earth of the Pacific Northwest, but the truth, like the roots of the great firs, eventually broke the surface, exposing the rot beneath. He will die in prison, his name forever etched in the history of Washington crime as a predator who thought he was smarter than the law, only to find out that the long arm of justice never truly sleeps. Number 9, Westley Allan Dodd, the monster who begged to die for his crimes against the children of Vancouver. In the pantheon of criminal depravity, there are few figures who evoke as much pure, unadulterated revulsion as Westley Allan Dodd, a man whose very name became synonymous with the ultimate violation of innocence and the darkest depths of human depravity. Operating in Vancouver, Washington, in the late 1980s, Dodd was not a serial killer who drifted under the radar for decades like Gary Ridgway, nor was he a charming psychopath like Ted Bundy. He was a chaotic, impulsive, and explosively violent predator who targeted children, fueled by a pedophilic rage that he lacked the will or the desired control. The case of Westley Dodd is unique in the history of Washington state justice, not only for the horrific nature of his crimes, the torture, sexual assault, and murder of 3 young boys, but for his startling and unprecedented desire to be executed, becoming one of the few inmates in modern history to voluntarily drop his appeals and demand that the state carry out his death sentence. His story is a harrowing journey into the mind of a compulsive offender who knew he was evil and recognized that the only way he would stop hurting children was if he was put to death. Born in Washington in 1961, Dodd's early life seemed relatively normal on the surface, but beneath it lay a festering compulsion toward violence and sexual deviance that began manifesting in his adolescence. By his own admission, he began fantasizing about molesting children as a teenager, and these urges escalated from voyeurism and exposure to molestation. He served time in prison for child molestation in the early 1980s, a failure of the justice system that would have catastrophic consequences for the community of Vancouver when he was released early for good behavior. He moved to Vancouver, a quiet suburb across the river from Portland, Oregon, and he took a job as a security guard, a position that gave him a uniform and a veneer of authority. He lived in a nondescript apartment, blending into background, all the while hunting for victims with a terrifying, single-minded focus. The nightmare began in earnest in September 1989, a month that would forever scar the history of the Pacific Northwest. On September 4th, Dodd was prowling a park in Vancouver, looking for a victim. He spotted 2 brothers, 11-year-old William Nieheisel and his 10-year-old brother Cole, who were playing at David Douglas Park. Dodd, using a mixture of trickery and force, lured the boys away from the safety of the public areas, likely promising them something or pretending to be an authority figure. He took them to a secluded wooded area near the park, where he attacked them. He bound them and subjected them to horrific sexual assaults and torture. The details of the crimes are almost too gruesome to recount, but the sheer brutality indicated a level of sadistic rage that was explosive and uncontrollable. After he had finished with his victims, Dodd decided to kill them to cover his tracks. He attempted to hang the boys in the woods. He left their bodies hidden among the trees, a grotesque secret amidst the beauty of the Pacific Northwest forest. When the boys failed to return home, a massive search was launched by their parents and the community. The discovery of their bodies 2 days later sent a wave of shock and panic through Vancouver. Parents were terrified. A predator was hunting their children in broad daylight, in their own parks. The police were under immense pressure to find the killer, but they had no leads, no witnesses, and no suspects. The community was paralyzed by grief and fear, unaware that the monster who had done this was still in their midst, preparing to kill again. Less than a month later, in October 1989, Dodd struck again, this time escalating his audacity. On October 29th, he entered a family home in Vancouver, looking for a victim. He found 4-year-old Leah Selly asleep in his bedroom. Dodd crept into the house, a violation of the ultimate sanctuary of the home, and abducted the sleeping child. He took Lee to his apartment, where he kept the child alive for a period, subjecting him to horrific abuse and torture. Dodd kept a detailed diary of his crimes, a log of his depravity that would later sicken even the most hardened detectives. In that apartment, he acted out his darkest fantasies on a helpless 4-year-old. The following day, Dodd took Lee to a wooded area, where he hanged the child from a tree, leaving his body exposed. The disappearance of Lee Yates terrified the city even more than the first crime. Now, children weren't just safe from strangers in parks. They weren't even safe in their own beds. The police investigation intensified, but again, Dodd had left little trace. He was a ghost, moving through the community, leaving destruction in his wake. However, Dodd's compulsions were his undoing. His need to offend was so intense that he couldn't wait. He couldn't plan meticulously. He was driven by a hunger that made him reckless. It was his recklessness that would lead to his capture, just as he was planning his next kill. On November 13, 1989, just 2 weeks after murdering Lee Yates, Dodd went to a movie theater in Portland, Oregon, just across the river from Vancouver. He was looking for another victim, scanning the crowd for a young boy he could grab. He attempted to abduct a 6-year-old boy inside the theater, but the child's father reacted instantly. He grabbed Dodd and held him until security arrived. It was a routine intervention that turned into the arrest of the century. When Portland police officers arrived, they questioned Dodd. He was acting erratically, and his behavior raised red flags. During the interrogation, Dodd's facade cracked. He waived his Miranda rights and began to talk. He confessed to the attempted abduction at the theater, but then, perhaps realizing the game was up or perhaps driven by a desire to unburden himself, he began to confess to the murders in Vancouver. He told detectives exactly where the bodies of the Nieheisel brothers and Lee Yates were. He described the crimes in a flat, matter-of-fact tone that was chilling in its lack of emotion. The Vancouver police were contacted, and they rushed to the locations Dodd described. They found Lee Yates' body exactly where he said it would be. The confession was corroborated by physical evidence. The monster who had terrorized Vancouver was in custody, and the full extent of his evil became apparent. The case against Westley Dodd was open and shut. He had confessed in detail to the 3 murders and the attempted abduction. The evidence, including his diary and the physical forensic data, was overwhelming. But what happened next was extraordinary in the annals of criminal justice. Dodd refused to fight the charges. He fired his attorneys and chose to represent himself, though he eventually allowed counsel to handle the procedural aspects. He pleaded guilty to all charges, and at a sentencing hearing, he told the judge that he did not want life in prison. He argued that he would kill again if he were ever given a chance, even in prison, and that he deserved to die. He waived his right to appeal, a decision that the legal system had a hard time processing. The court must determine if a defendant is competent to waive their rights, and Dodd was evaluated extensively. Psychologists and psychiatrists interviewed him and found that he was indeed sane, in a legal sense. He knew what he was doing, and he knew the consequences. He was a psychopath who recognized that he was a danger to society and wanted to be executed. The judge, faced with the defendant begging for the death penalty and the families of the victims demanding justice, sentenced Dodd to death. It was a sentence that Dodd himself welcomed. He asked to be hanged, the traditional method of execution in Washington state, instead of lethal injection, because he felt it was the most appropriate punishment for his crimes. The years leading up to his execution were a legal struggle, but not on Dodd's behalf. His attorneys, bound by ethics to defend their client, tried to file appeals against his wishes, arguing that he was mentally ill or that the death penalty was unconstitutional. Dodd fought them every step of the way, writing letters to the governor and the courts demanding that they stop the appeals and let the execution proceed. He wrote a manifesto called The Letters to the Court, detailing his crimes and his desire to die. He became a proponent of his own execution, arguing that it was the only way to ensure he never hurt another child. Finally, in 1993, after all avenues of appeal were exhausted, the state of Washington scheduled his execution. On January 5, 1993, Westley Allan Dodd was hanged at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. It was the first execution carried out by the state since 1963. Dodd ate a final meal of salmon and potatoes, and he went to the gallows without making any final statements of remorse, simply accepting his fate. He died at 12:05 a.m. The execution was controversial. Some argued that the state should not fulfill a murderer's suicide wish, while others, including the victims' families, felt a grim satisfaction that the monster who had taken their children was finally gone. The legacy of Westley Allan Dodd is one profound tragedy and a unique legal footnote in Washington history. His crimes forced a nationwide conversation about the treatment of sex offenders and the failure of the justice system to manage repeat offenders. The fact that he was released early after his first molestation charge to go on and murder 3 children became a rallying cry for stricter sentencing laws and longer incarceration for pedophiles. His case is often studied by criminologists not just because of the brutality of the acts, but because of Dodd's psychological profile, a man who lacked the impulse control to stop himself and possessed the self-awareness to know he needed to be stopped permanently. The Westley Dodd case serves as the darkest example of the predatory pedophile, a human being whose very existence was defined by the destruction of innocence. For the families of William and Cole Nieheisel and Leah Selly, the execution brought a measure of closure, though the pain of their loss can never be erased. Vancouver eventually moved on, but the scars of that autumn in 1989 remain a part of the city's history. Westley Dodd is gone, executed by the very state he challenged to stop him, but the memory of his evil serves as a permanent, haunting reminder of the vulnerability of the young and the monstrous potential that can hide in the most unassuming of men. He wanted to die to stop himself, and in the end, he got exactly what he wanted, a cold and final end to a life of horror. Number 10. Israel Keyes, the meticulous traveler who viewed murder as a hobby and left a trail of hidden graves across the country, including the quiet woods of Enumclaw, Washington. In the chilling annals of serial murder, where the profiles of killers often adhere to predictable patterns of sexual compulsion or geographic loyalty, Israel Keyes stands as a terrifying anomaly, a new breed of predator who broke all the rules. He was not a drifter driven by lust, nor a charmer seeking intimacy. He was a strategic, disciplined, and profoundly intelligent thrill killer who viewed the act of taking a human life as a recreational pursuit, a dark hobby that he meticulously planned between his jobs as a construction worker and his duties as a father. While his crimes spanned the entire United States, from Alaska to Vermont, Washington State holds a significant chapter in the dark saga of Israel Keyes, serving as a home for many years and a hunting ground for at least one confirmed victim, a woman whose disappearance in Enumclaw remained a mystery for over a decade until Keyes decided to speak. Born in 1978 in Utah, Keyes spent his formative years in Colville, Washington, a remote rural community in Stevens County. It was here, in the dense forest and isolation of the Pacific Northwest, that he honed the survivalist skills that would later make him such a formidable killer. He was raised in a strict, fundamentalist Mormon household, an environment that likely instilled in him a deep-seated repression and a rigid worldview that would eventually fracture. He joined the U.S. Army in 1998, serving as a specialist stationed at Fort Lewis and later in Fort Hood, Texas, and in Egypt, where he further developed his tactical training, learned to handle weapons with precision, and mastered the art of self-discipline. By the time he returned to civilian life, settling in Anchorage, Alaska, while maintaining deep ties to Washington State, Israel Keyes was a man ready to wage a one-man war against society, a war fought in silence and shadows, where the victims were selected not for who they were, but simply for the opportunity they presented. The defining characteristic of Israel Keyes' murder methodology was his concept of cruising for murder. Unlike traditional serial killers who stuck to a comfort zone, Keyes derived satisfaction from the randomness and the logistical challenge of killing in different jurisdictions. He viewed murder as a project, an endeavor that required as much planning as a military operation. He would fly from his home in Alaska to a major city hub like Seattle, rent a car, and then drive thousands of miles away to a location where he had no connection, scouting for victims. He buried kill kits, containing weapons, plastic bags, lime, and cleaning supplies, in various states long before he intended to use them, ensuring that evidence was never cross-contaminated and that he was always prepared. This methodical approach made him invisible to law enforcement. There was no geographic profile connecting a murder in Vermont to a murder in Washington because the killer lived thousands of miles away in Alaska. It is believed that Keyes killed at least 11 people, but he hinted at numbers far higher, perhaps upward of 20 or more, with the dark reality being that we may never know the full extent of his victim list because he took the majority of his secrets to the grave. His victims were men, women, and couples chosen without discrimination, targeted simply because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time when Israel Keyes was on the prowl. The Washington State chapter of the Israel Keyes Saga centers on the confirmed murder of a woman named Cassandra Curley in Enumclaw, a small city located in the foothills of Mount Rainier, roughly 40 miles southeast of Seattle. On September 18, 1998, Cassandra, a 31-year-old woman, described by those who knew her as a kind but vulnerable individual struggling with the challenges of life on the streets, was last seen in the area of Enumclaw. She vanished without a trace, a tragedy that might have been dismissed as a simple disappearance of a transient woman were it not for the eventual confession of her killer. For years, her family and friends wondered what happened to her, and the Enumclaw Police Department kept her case open. But without a body and without a suspect, the investigation went cold. Unbeknownst to them, the man responsible was Israel Keyes, who was living in Washington at the time and was operating with the same cold calculation that would define his later years. It wasn't until over a decade later, after Keyes was in custody for a high-profile kidnapping in Alaska, that the truth about what happened to Cassandra Curley came to light. Keyes admitted to picking her up, driving her to a remote, wooded location near Enumclaw, and killing her. He disposed of her body in a way that made it difficult to find, a common tactic in his arsenal. He claimed to have buried her, but the exact location remained a puzzle he allowed only cryptic clues for. This revelation terrified the community of Enumclaw, realizing that one of the most prolific serial killers in American history had walked their streets, hunting among them, long before the world knew his name. While the Curley murder is a confirmed Washington link, Keyes' footprint in the Pacific Northwest is heavy and disturbing. He lived for a time on the Makah Indian Reservation in Nebe, Washington, a location as far west as one could go in contiguous United States. While living there, he was constructing a cabin, an endeavor that, in hindsight, may have served as a bunker or a storage location for more of his buried caches. He was known to the community as a quiet, polite man who worked hard and kept himself a master of blending in. He would drive for hours across the state, utilizing the vast wilderness of the Olympic Peninsula and the Cascades as his personal playground. Investigators now believe that during his years residing in Washington and traveling between Washington and Alaska, he likely committed additional murders that remain unsolved. The vast, rugged terrain of the state, with its dense forests and miles of uninhabited coastline, served as the perfect graveyard for a man who took such care in hiding his work. The realization that Israel Keyes, a man who died in 2012, could have left bodies hidden in the mountains of Washington state that have yet to be discovered is a haunting specter for law enforcement and a source of endless anguish for the families of missing persons in the region. The unraveling of Israel Keyes began not in Washington, but in Anchorage, Alaska, in February 2012, with the brazen kidnapping of 18-year-old Samantha Koenig. Keyes snatched Samantha from a coffee stand kiosk in broad daylight, a crime caught on surveillance cameras. This abduction was uncharacteristic for Keyes in its immediacy and proximity to his home, violating his own rules about distance and anonymity. He held Samantha hostage, raped her, and eventually murdered her. But he did not stop there. In a cruel and calculated twist designed to torment her family and confuse the police, he sent a ransom demand and a photo of Samantha holding a newspaper that was dated after her death, implying she was still alive. He then returned from a cruise he had taken, during which he likely used a stolen credit card from one of his other victims, retrieved Samantha's body, dismembered her to prevent identification, and dumped her remains in a frozen lake north of Anchorage. For months, Samantha's disappearance captivated the nation. Keyes played the role of the concerned citizen, even discussing the case with people in his community, all while holding the secrets of her death. However, his arrogance eventually led to his downfall. He used Samantha's debit card in Texas and Arizona, withdrawing money and purchasing items. This digital trail gave the FBI the break they needed. In March 2012, police in Lufkin, Texas, stopped Keyes on a routine traffic stop. He was driving a vehicle with a stolen license plate and in possession of a weapon and Samantha Koenig's debit card. He was arrested, and the house of cards began to collapse. Once in custody in Anchorage, Israel Keyes engaged in a high-stakes psychological battle with the FBI. He was a man who took pride in his intellect and his ability to outsmart the authorities. He confessed to the murder of Samantha Koenig, offering to lead investigators to her body in exchange for certain privileges, such as access to reading materials and better food conditions. He led them to the frozen lake where her remains had been dumped, and eventually, divers recovered her dismembered body, confirming his confession. But the FBI sensed that Samantha was just the tip of the iceberg. During months of intensive interrogation, a chilling portrait of a cross-country serial killer began to emerge. Keyes, seemingly bored with the prospect of sitting in a jail cell for years, began to confess to other crimes, treating the interview room like a stage where he could recount his greatest hits. He confessed to the double murder of Bill and Lorraine Currier in Essex, Vermont, in 2011, describing how he broke into their home, tied them up, and took them to an abandoned farmhouse where he killed them. He confessed to the murder of Cassandra Curley in Enumclaw, Washington, providing details only the killer would know. He spoke in riddles and hypotheticals about other murders, describing a robbery of a couple on a boat in Washington, a theory that investigators believe refers to the murders of a couple found deceased in circumstances that matched his description. The most terrifying aspect of the interrogation was Keyes' refusal to identify every victim. He admitted to at least 11 murders, but hinted at more, often saying things like, "I can tell you about the ones who've been identified, but I won't tell you about the others." He seemed to relish the power he held over the families of the missing, dangling the possibility of closure only to snatch it away. He drew maps to the FBI, showing locations where he had buried kill kits or bodies, but the maps were often vague or the locations too vast to search effectively. He described a bank robbery in New York State, where he believed he had killed someone, but the body was never found. He spoke of a woman in New Jersey who he had killed years ago, a case that has never been definitively linked. The FBI released recordings of his voice and details of his crimes in the desperate hope that the public could help identify the remaining victims. But Keyes' meticulousness worked against him. He traveled so extensively and killed so randomly that connecting the dots was nearly impossible. He was a predator who weaponized the American road system, turning the interstate highways into a map of his conquests. The legal and psychological conclusion of the Israel Keyes saga was as abrupt and controlled as his life. Facing federal charges for the kidnapping and murder of Samantha Koenig, and knowing that the death penalty or a lifetime of solitary confinement awaited him, Keyes decided to maintain control over his own destiny until the very end. On the morning of December 2nd, 2012, while being held in the Anchorage jail awaiting trial, Keyes was found dead in his cell. He had committed suicide by slitting his wrists and strangling himself with bedding. He left a note behind, which was partially a will and partially a collection of cryptic thoughts. But more importantly, he left the world with a permanent sense of incompleteness. By taking his own life, Israel Keyes cheated the justice system of the satisfaction of a trial and a sentencing, and he cheated the families of his unknown victims of the chance to learn the truth. He died exactly as he lived, on his own terms, withholding his secrets, and leaving a void where answers should have been. The silence of his cell was a final act of defiance against the investigators who had tried to pry open his mind. The legacy of Israel Keyes is a lingering nightmare for the Pacific Northwest and the nation. He represented a new evolution of serial killer, one that is not bound by geography, sexual pathology, or the need for notoriety, but rather driven by a nihilistic desire to hunt and kill for the sheer experience of it. His time in Washington, from the forests of Colville to the streets of Enumclaw and the wilderness of Knee Bay, serves as a stark reminder that evil can live next door, can help build a community, can be a quiet neighbor, and can be a meticulous planner of death all at the same time. The Enumclaw Police Department and other Washington agencies continue to investigate cold cases with Keyes in mind, poring over old files and searching the wilderness for the caches he hinted at. They know that there are likely bodies hidden in the mountains of Washington state, victims of a man who considered murder a craft and whose name will forever be associated with the darkest corners of the American landscape. Israel Keyes is gone, but the echoes of his hobby remain, scattered across the map like unmarked graves, waiting in the silence of the woods for the truth to one day be found. The case stands as a testament to the fact that even in the modern age of DNA and digital surveillance, a man disciplined enough to live in the shadows can still become a ghost, terrifyingly real and devastatingly efficient.